That was great, and we'll have a small question time which will segue into panel discussion on the nature of mind and consciousness. So let me start by asking Geshes if you have any questions to pose.
Tanda tsenri tarwe gyurim shugoro beta tendi tsenri tarwe gyurim shugoro nga tsebuna chagmidro ina ta tsenri ya mangbuji tarwe gyurim nanglo la je sarde shugoro sarje dine mangbuji chungyo bit dine tsona lido abordo tanda magam tsenri nanglo la tanda chik dudengi namsha dine ya shimju nangyong de zambala peje kurang nanglo shimju tseto chimju ya libge bese tsona lido ra taina tanda wangze tsenri ki desen nang lan rugi yoba ina mena tanda diyo wala wanza tsenri nang la tan yuldo tsenri singen tang yang ani karsore gomki tsenri san tanda diyo wala ani yang chi karsore semkam rikwas tende tegi nuba tendang di nipa ngagam tsenri di ni ki ani yargin do tang tenda di ni nuba tendang ni dila pechi tis kebar yoba sondoshi di di zambala tanda wanza tsenri nanglo ni yanchi sarji shugorobe tisya dila nuba chiru ten yakin tende tsenri soba kayinare tsenri gerba yinare dila ya chik tusam shi yena mena di tola ya chik tsenri ki takalo soba nanglo ni di tazu ji kandi chena se di kandi shioji no.
This question is for both of speakers, presenters, and when we look at the development of history of scientific developments, there are many stages of developments, and especially in quantum, especially in physics, we have made a lot of progresses, and we have detailed in very subtle details about the particle physics, and we have made a lot of achievements in this field. And as compared to this physics subject, the neuroscience part, whether it is psychology or whether it's contemplative or neuroscience in general, is far lagging behind. So what could be the major reasons for this kind of differences in terms of development, and how you see it?
Yeah, I'd like to hear both of you answer this.
I have no idea, but it's a science question for the scientists.
I'm not sure I can give you a good answer to that. Neuroscience and psychology have been lagging very far behind in this, but some physicists are now trying to tackle this in ways that we can understand. For the first century of quantum physics, they talked about consciousness being an elementary construct in the universe that has some causal effect on the physical world. But they never went into detail about that because they're physicists and they don't deal with things like that. But in the last 10 years or so, there have been a few collaborations between quantum physicists and neuroscientists to try to explain consciousness in terms of quantum mechanical processes. And these are very rudimentary efforts right now, but they are bringing together psychologists, cognitive scientists, and quantum physicists to try to see if there's a way to be more rigorous about how to define the role of consciousness in the universe by some quantum mechanics.
And just a comment, and Roger Penrose has written about this, and he probably was in the lead on some of this. It's not trivial because there are still very profound issues of quantum physics that are not well understood just within the realm of physicists. There are acausal effects in the laboratory that are not yet fully understood. There are correlated, associated phenomena on macroscopic scales that are not fully understood. So it's one of those difficult situations where you're trying to marry a field that is itself not still fully mature after a century with a field that is, quite robustly immature. Yeah. And it's not clear how to proceed, in fact. You're not applying a finely honed, utterly mature, understood subject of quantum theory to a brave new world. It's a little messier than that.
I would add to that these physicists who are being so brave as to tackle the question of what does it mean to be conscious and how does it relate to the physical world are sometimes criticized very highly by other quantum physicists who insists that quantum physics is purely a mathematical model. It is not meant to be real. It is just a mathematical way of trying to make predictions. And it's a mistake to try to get concrete about it and try to be real about it.
And to just keep bouncing backwards and forwards here a little, and the evidence of that is the fact that in the profound philosophic and conceptual issues raised by quantum theory were clear to the practitioners in the first few decades, in the 1920s and 1930s, Heisenberg, Bohr, Einstein, and so on. And they essentially punted, or they sort of set aside most of that profound subtlety and incomprehension, and in favor of something called the Copenhagen interpretation from Niels Bohr's influence in the 1930s, where they just became pragmatists who applied the theory. In the quantum electrodynamic theory, it's accurate to the 12th decimal place. It's an incredibly precise theory, works in the lab hundreds of thousands of times a day, and most practicing physicists set aside philosophical explorations, and it became, as Bruce implies, somewhat disreputable to put that on the table, although it was never addressed. It was never properly dealt with, even by the titans of the field, the true geniuses who conjured up the theory first. So it's sort of still waiting to happen.
But part of the reason that the physicists may not have tackled the very issues of mind and all this consciousness more kind of seriously may have to do again the methods by which the experiments are done. The heavy emphasis on the third person approach. I think that in many ways would prevent to tackle that something that is essentially an experiential world that one needs to bring that subjective kind of the part as well. That's why the behaviorism was when the scientists finally began to tackle the psychology. It was behaviorism, because you can measure the behaviors of you cannot. They put the mind in the black box. You cannot talk about the mind, but what you can talk is stimulus and the response. So you can measure the response and then not the stimulus. Only in the 50s, when the cognitive psychologists, after the artificial intelligence kind of computers were developed, and then with some idea of kind of this information processing, then they began to create the new models of the mind and the memory and so forth, perceptions and so forth. So I think that it has to do also with the method, that for investigating the mind is not, the third person approach is not so direct way of investigating when it comes to mental states.
And maybe more questions. And while we have questions here, as we move into the panel discussion, I invite the audience to contribute another set of questions on any topic that's been mentioned today, and some, of course, were already raised yesterday, and we'll feed them into the discussion.
When I came here, I have a question in my mind, but the presenters, they already had given answer to this question, so I don't have a question, but I would like to say a little bit of my idea related with the presentation. Under the leadership of Geshe Lagdola and Dr. Bryce Johnson, for the past 1 month, we were taught science, and I'm very much satisfied with the lessons that we have been through, and I'm thankful to them.
Kazan kami nama da, tiri kami nama che, ani maungpa da kami nama ganga dili ya panse tenri ki tuni roboya ji da kata do meba ji chogun dus.
So, as far as my understanding is concerned, the topics that we have covered yesterday and that we have so far covered this morning, and the topics that may come tomorrow or the afternoon, I think that these all topics are interrelated.
Ani ngarong ki nyanyo tuni ani ji shubi na ngarong jido ki jaje lo ni jawa le je lo ni tsa so ri ya phama de so chini khama de ba je an je rum bo jin ro yes an sam sang le ya phama de so pha ji tank de sam ba la ani ji yoni yon de ji tank de be sam ba la ya ani ji yige je ani le je ani ne su jin jo bo jin jo yong de yes ro ba an ten ji son tang de sam ba la ya ji ne su ma bo ji le dewa che ni jiga yasare samsa nyuso yungu deus
Dewa yungu
marang nyuso tin ro ta ja ji ni ta lo mombo ji ya yungu du sang deus chiri me do ma se marang samsa te na nyu ro
So I came to India in 1988, and for the past many years I live in India, and I'm staying away from my parents. And whenever I remember my parents and miss my hometown, I try to contact them with different ways of communication. And this one.
dami se chi che mo de san ti che is mo ba de so le mantene de le nyam ji che yal de ba yes
I think what he meant is that, like, because of science and technology and because of scientific achievements, it was very much easier for them to communicate with parents and relatives back there in Tibet. And I hope that this kind of dialogue and the program will continue in future also.
초단의 고관나무 도제 이 주어디 기실로 스탠즈란 슈이 제상과 단다디 기실라기 단다 담시 시라기디 사보다 딘나수 도제 슈이 다디나로 닝가란수다 삼주로 지기나 다디 조 셰바당 셰베 니 셰바 요버 룹수 콜 다 주시 딘데 럽시리 디나로 니 주디 닝부로 베나단다 다른 쇼게 경화단다 the Bruce Gerson la Korangi taji gewangchi korne sungde taji shebe namsha mangush teshikyon truburi taganashi ani kishilos nizla ne taganashi ginasu dindi samadang anzu togoji khari yungudu shuna bena kishila kirang oso bage Emory University na role churi gin jiglobens na ne shugyo ba inza tanganzu nangbada chiri bas mogoche tadru gi gyabjong yebe bena sheba kelembe chojigdang ani tanda sheba yoba thamma chebe ani disinjig ni yongorwa chezanga sheba tadru gi gyabjong yobe sheba yoba kele gengi nganzu ngoni anchi sheba di rathoya da ani shebe yu riksu da dinde gi kolla ani tablam do khari nyeyo nas sawa digan anchi maung bol da dingi ni thumbi cha suye kolla ani kisla rangi anchi susugi da chalen tarna chachi kharina shuena dikol surona shue hada nganzu penata sheba sudisam dom gebela la ushu chadu go kunshi sineri dagana shinna ba sheba sini simjus ni karsini se shiri bodi shebe ngozam shana digi yo inza tadi mai bechin benada siri ba changwa da mare de zo samkam ribo wanam gi shebe namsha tapiji geju si digi yo ba do sedu yungu dindi zambane da sheba ke lembe nganzu ngwen digan 마음반다 가데나 단다 타만 야시 가르시기요나 스타 조디 기실랄 간디슈에두시 도제나
Thank you for the opportunity, and my question goes to Geshe Lobsangla. Since you are working at Emory University as a Buddhist professor, and normally when we talk about the consciousness, or the theory of consciousness, there are some section of people who have a philosophical background about what is consciousness and who believe in the existence of consciousness are separate from the brain. And there are a section of people, I think mainly scientists, who don't believe in reincarnation and consciousness as what we believe. And so when us, from our side, when we believe, those who believe in the consciousness and the idea of reincarnation and rebirth, when we try to engage with those non-believers about, and what kind of methods that you found prevailing to engage with those people. And for us, when we talk about the consciousness and nature of consciousness, it is easy to say something that is clear in nature and knowing by function. But when you engage with someone who has a completely different view or the definition of consciousness, so it's a different thing. So what you have found in the past, the methods that to deal with non-believers, and what plans you have in the future to have dialogue with other people.
Lo kashe ring la page nupcho deche ani nupcho ki chik seri ba inare ta du pa ke inare kuna to ta chik ship che test chik to lang cha ta tene ki go jong song sa chik shu ba ina chik ta pena kyo nga chi kel lembe thone chik ta shebe nam sha ta tene cha tis ta peche ta chik chulu nupcho cha sha ina chulu thone tene te chulu cha sha ina pena issue dan ju ta khache chulu tis ni kyo nga ma keleng marwal kyo chima ta chik yo chi ma to ta ru ma ken tu na la kan ta chi ina peche nya chira gyu mel ta nga choi ge ta chi pena da samsena shebe nam sha chik nupcho ki ta chik kyawan so re na dan chik nyam do dolen chati jakshu ta tanda pen cognitive scientist ne yong do cognitive psychologist na ta chik de yudo samkam request chi o de peche nangchu tan ta chik nangchu tan nyam do chan ne chik tunjo kare yume ani chik daga na shin chik pena na zo tempe kola tempe ina re daga na shin wang she pe da mixie ina re de dan de shin ge ani chik da nyongchor ge kore arwa emotion se ta o de ne ge de ta konje ge pe ship za wi shue che je chik ta je che je de ge to ta kan de su yong gu yume 그래서 그런 감지 야고 시고 알아 배전 넘버 스킨 게 알아데 녀게 페네바 지 점점 채널이 바꾸나서 냠도 제제 롭디 제다 되는 거 거기한테 담바 어디서터네 튼배 초세가 왔다 지 데이터를 펜스 니가 로게래다 니게 돌아야지 펜도 제기 남 고급들의 망부지 연구에서 낭쇼터네 배제 대경으로 뭐게 냐마도 같이 간나야를 즉 약쇼때 배제 cognitive and the science and cognitive psychology to yudo centrics in that some kind of shona did 배제 that kind of yudo centric but 저게 but shebe jawa 간데 지게 몇번은 안 저기 아니 잠바 이나 레다나 데나 대신 게 아니 잠닝제 단테 초콜릿 레온 거 같은 저기 당한 나시는 저기 이해를 제바 답변에 이제다 근데 걸 십자부 지체지 대달라 낭초더니 건조기 로겔에 망부지 작사래 삼삼 저도 낭초더니 차샤바이나 아직 세션 리버시베스니 레사타니 템파티니 코티티피 모발니 지 메제퍼 제파테네 치키트 테네 치키 천이 샤와 짬마이바 아직 페나왕제 토네 즉 대화 거와차고요메 아제 완제 그래 견셔와이나 템파테서 냠샤 간데 용거면 디털라 시라 로겔에 예사라 삼삼치도 I was just saying that over the few years that I've been in the West, have had opportunity to interact with some of the scientists and scholars that come from the Western traditions. Certainly, when it comes to the topic of mind and the mental realm, approaching it from the perspective of having previous and future lives, it's somewhat limited to religious tradition. Even in religious tradition, in the monolithic religious tradition, that the previous life is not accepted. The one maintains that you have this life and then it continues into the future. But there is no position about the previous life. And the philosophical position, I'm not that familiar with the Western philosophical positions, but I've had some opportunities to interact with the scientists, particularly cognitive psychologists and those who are working in the realm of emotions. And there that I find that Buddhism and the cognitive science has a lot to learn from each other and complement each other, particularly the mental states like the memory, how the memory is formed, how it is understood, same thing with the perceptions, the emotions, even the emotional states like compassion and so forth, there is the empathy and so forth, attention. There is a growing understanding, not just theories, but kind of the experimental based understanding about these various mental functions and states, and that's where that Buddhism certainly has a lot to say. But for Buddhists, what we can learn from the scientists is those kind of physical or the physical elements that are involved in the making of or in producing these mental states and so forth. Certainly for the Buddhist, there is a lot to offer in terms of how to cultivate, how to enhance those mental states. So it's a very kind of the rich field for interaction between science and the Buddhism.
I'll go to a question from the audience, a very good one. Why do we see very few women discussing consciousness here, or in general, I would say, when we know it is they who bring new life into the world? Their experience of forging a new life within may give us answers to where consciousness comes from. Who wants to take that?
Yeah, I think that we definitely should have more women participating in these dialogues. Definitely, I think that there's no question about the role of women. That they certainly clearly they are more empathetic. That studies show that women have greater empathy as opposed to men. And in all kind of realms of our discussions, I think that we definitely should have more women participation in the future.
And I'll be more specific and say that I think that is an action item for us in organizing any future dialogues. But in general, we see some dichotomy, maybe that's too strong a word, between Eastern and Western views or approaches, methodological approaches, philosophy, conceptual approaches, and I don't believe in strong cleaving between genders in general, but there are definitely illuminations that would come from having a balanced perspective. So we'll definitely take that. That's very good advice.
Let me just add one bit to that. There are many studies showing that women experience more spiritually diverse states than men do. And when they do experience these altered states, they're more likely to engage them more fully than men do. But what women do not do is try to understand it and put it in terms that they can translate to other people. That's something that men are more likely to try to do. So that's why you may see, although more women experience spiritual states, more men try to study them and try to understand them.
This is a question, this is probably for Bruce, this is from the audience again. It relates to that, the business of having to describe. Why are, and you alluded a little bit to this, why are out-of-body conscious experiences so much related with our body senses, seeing, hearing, feeling? They're specific to the human experience, when you might imagine that an out-of-body experience could encompass all sorts of, have qualities that were well beyond sensory. Is that sort of just a problem that you described of the difficulty of verbalizing something that may be hard to verbalize?
I think that is the problem, and this is best typified by the people that Kenneth Ring interviewed who were blind from birth, and in their near-death experience, they could become aware of things, including colors, which they have no experience with. And when we demand that they tell us about them, they use the vocabulary of vision, which is the only vocabulary we have to describe what things look like. And clearly they weren't seeing things. They weren't in their bodies, and whatever they were in didn't have eyes, so they weren't seeing things the way we were. Plus, for these people, their normal physical eyes didn't work. And yet, when we ask them, what did it look like? You have to use the words of vision. So we're forcing people, when they have out-of-body experiences, to use body language to describe it to us.
This is a question for the Geshes from someone in the audience. Whether Buddhism has a way of talking about some of the some of the evidence that Bruce was talking about. For example, a situation where the person who died, the reincarnation was 6 months old when the next person was born, so overlapping lives, if you like, or the experience of meeting with relatives who are unknown to the person. Do some of those pieces of evidence that Bruce was talking about, do they make sense in a Buddhist tradition?
Jodi kiran suche ndi tanda choge gen Bruce legi tanda tamshik nanglola ani kewachima de tewe ke pangta mangbuchi shesons cheza di ndi zambala pechashana ani jika kewa ne de che de shi ani shesimbe ke ani mitinde ta tuye ke nawa ke esto dinde do ani tedan sungbe ke ani ke je shedan yamena nizu dinde ani nangchu ton shigre nanglo shigre weslash
tojena joshi dia ushirado pena taran joge Dr. the Bruce Lag ta beje khasawore da ratrebe dinde ta ji parda dinde mangu stena so dinde sambane dige di samane khaji ngarangi nima kongyongyo dinde resha ine dige di nangchu gngone dagana singi kyangi sumbana shi ta ji mazumasana gewanga chi droye di khelemba jire di nalo ne gewanga chi drodan di namshi chamjani droye sungdi gore dinde sambane pena dinde gi neju dawo dinde namgi ne ta ji yoyo bodo sine ngarara gergi ton shuwenya peje midi kewanyama redi dine chimare ni chizangi de dos nyogu dos tan dine ratro dine kai shueme ine nangbe chulu gi nalo ne anchi namshi gi nyenzam jartan di taran kerang gi sumbana shi chimala pena tapena ngazu ta sebuchen shugi na tugu ngunji nangdang gi korgi da rodan jorwa dingoni shugi na pena ta kyanggurum che dawu tugu ngunji nangdang di anchi kundyung ku kome anchi kharsugore namgyu chashe na de gi changyo la so ba tigeta shira ge ragbare tinde gi ngone ni chi kundu yangsi chungmata ba da ku shuni tune ni nganzu masan tigeti ngota choto yong he ta na singi chi kundu ku kome tugi mi ngo chamba digi dirangshing yong de ta tinde rabu nga tanda nga zu gu tuzu la pesun yakshu rabu tinde rabu sri chidane de na shingi ani pe tubi ku chunju dinde yangsi dinde mangbu gi ji khashe gi nyima gi soso gi desa tin ta ga na chi soso gi nyenze tin tinde shi mangbu chi yong de go re digi de sa sebu shira re di indu sambane nangshu gi ngone ani ji kharsu go re tile loss rabu ji shiu dinde ganzo karang soso gi nyamnyo gu tonde kai shwe me de ini ni kirangi parri ta dagana shingi tembe gi nyongwe gi tonen tindi yungu tu sungwe gi sungba nashi manzu ngone yoyo bashi namgyung gi nezu shires timbiksi gi sevus ka yomars tele seros tango es ka yomars
All the evidence of rebirth that is shown by Dr. Bruce Grayson in the morning, many of them are personally known to me. Like, I know about this kind of research and these incidents, even though I don't know it at first hand. But this kind of birthmarks and this evidence are very much common in our tradition, because we believe in reincarnation and we believe in life after death. And when we talk about the life after death and reincarnation, we believe that our mind, a stream of mind, from the one life goes to the next, and through that way, the reincarnation takes place. And I can't say that like I have a direct experience of how reincarnation happens, but the best example that we can see in our society or we can give you from our society is like recognition of these high lamas or the high Buddhist spiritual leaders like His Holiness Dalai Lama, and we try to find the process of finding reincarnations of these spiritual leaders. We show like ordinary objects like that belongs to the past life, and there are many cases. The present reincarnated Lama, he can recognize those objects, and that's this kind of like things are very much common in our tradition and our belief.
The sosong when the agic tongue out in the hago in the Yamuda came made the Dajic Codula, Penangaras, Nala Chasha, and Nima, Nala, Anila de Wujo, Tana Tonsar Yomara, in Koranyama, Daji Rabjungi, Tomba Lensa, the Udita, Lama Kukumaji, Tomba Yashu, and Korangi, that Lama de Koramita, Rabjun Tombeshu, Kabla, Ming, Lobsan, Dewal, and Dustire. And she's done Lama Koran, Gongo Zoche, and Yansi did that to speech, and Yansi the Dual Pinta, Nimachi, Anila Koran, to Stjava Sumudala. So, Jenny better 10 tango Jesumba, which did not book from Yansi did to Pagel shoes, Lamsan dus Anila Jewa, the Lamsan, Rosanda Katule and Dusta, Korangu Komegi, Ming Nansa Jodi, Anibetia, Shunye Mokran, Madusong, Dindeda, Shimba Koetila, Nazashi was Mizanji Nala, at the Mikimbash Tronchi, the Dig Matongoni, Korangi, the Udo which Kalorda, and Mizandi, that the Pomujil dus Deche. Just do you do your Juma that they could share across now like Push and Batch get some but the deep Annie Taji Kawa in Badumuzi Halana. And Juma Bugu data Lord News and Takede share to Nimang yet to you the Kawaii and those hope the Tiwata within day. That does Kujo to Chung like Tang, Yonda, that Gawama Chela, that make Nima Kosachu soon show the Jagana and the Chumadi, Yonda, Deading Rast and Kuyo that you do is to stand that she had within this in Tujana.
So, in addition to what my friend has said, I would like to give 2 examples about remembering past lives. I have a nun relative, and she is a nun, and so she has got a spiritual teacher, and her spiritual teacher gave her spiritual name as Yangji Dora, Lobsang Dolma. And after some time, that spiritual teacher passed away. And later on, they found his reincarnation. And And at the first time when she came to know about her spiritual master's reincarnation, he was around 2 to 3 years old. And so that nun went to visit her spiritual master, the reincarnated young boy. And as soon as she entered the door, the small boy asked her, "Oh, Lobsangdoma, how are you doing, how you came here?" So this is the Lobsangdoma name that is given by that previous Lama to her, and this is an example. And then there's also another example. I think this is also one of his relatives. There's an old man. He gave one torcus or like jewel to a nun or something like that. And after that man passed away, and he was reborn as a small boy in their family. And later, when he was old enough to speak, he recognized that torcus that his previous life was given to this nun. And so these are kind of few examples that I am aware of, and such kind of examples are very much common in our tradition and our society.
There are other ways in which a child can get information about a past life, or the theoretical ways. For example, a deceased spirit can possess a child and cohabit that body with the child's spirit, or a disembodied spirit could theoretically displace the child's spirit and take over that body. Or information about a deceased person can exist in some discarnate state, the way information from your personal computer gets loaded up into the cloud where other people can access it. And maybe the child is accessing this information. These are all theoretically possible, but none of them explains the data from these children as well as the reincarnation hypothesis does. And that doesn't explain all of it. So what we may be seeing is that these children do not all have one explanation. Some may be better explained by reincarnation, some better by possession, and some better by some other means we don't know yet.
Here's a question from the audience. Suppose consciousness is compared with some kind of an energy, then it can be measured if that is so. If consciousness leaves the physical body, our body should be lighter in the absence. Has this ever been attempted or measured? It just reminds me of attempts to measure the weight of a soul from fleeing a body, but you will know the research, so. Or either of you, actually.
I'll say something.
There actually have been some attempts to measure what departs at death, and the first one I know of was done by William McDougall at Harvard University in around 1910, and he came up with 37 grams as the answer. But various people have noted that when someone is on their deathbed, water vapor evaporates from their bodies and their breath expels, and there are various things that can account for small amounts of weight loss. And you really need to do this type of study in some type of vacuum-enclosed encounter, which people don't usually die in. But the question really is, what are you measuring? And why would we assume that whatever energy the consciousness is an energy that we are able to measure? But we know of certain types of energy which don't seem to correspond to consciousness, but there are obviously energies that we're not able to measure at this point. And we have to make assumptions about what we can measure, we have the technology to measure.
Not from the Buddhist standpoint that is commonly accepted, within all schools of Buddhism, but certainly from the Vajrayana Buddhist point of view, the consciousness is not completely kind of independent or separated from any form of energy. The coarse consciousness is certainly correlated with the coarse energies, and even they have their biochemical kind of substrates as their substrates, but about the subtle consciousness, the most subtle consciousness, which is usually what the clear light of death is referred to as the most subtle energy mind complex. And Tibetan word is lung, which if we say that it's just kind of some kind of energy, then it certainly is an energy, but such very subtle mental state and its energy correlate, if you will, are not necessarily two distinct entities, but basically it's kind of a same entity with two expressions, the subjective and the energy nature. But such most subtle energy, I don't know if there would be a measuring device that can really measure its weight. I mean, it probably is weightless energy, but nonetheless, there are phenomena, as you all probably know, in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, when accomplished masters, sometimes not even necessarily very accomplished masters, when they die, they enter into what is known as Tugdam. It's a kind of the heart meditation. That is, that when the clinical death has occurred, but still such a person's all kind of the physiological states remain intact, instead of deteriorating or decomposing. At times they can go for weeks. Just a couple of years ago, one of the great masters in South India who remained in that post-death meditation, if you will, or Tukdam, for 18 days. But now the scientists, actually from Richard Davidson's lab, they had left some device to measure some kind of heat, if you will, or some signals, that may be measured at the heat, whether the differences in terms of the heat, and such energy, might be picked up by if there is a very kind of sensitive machine like that. But that's something that yet to be seen, But it's something that His Holiness is very interested in. And when Rich Davidson was here in Dharamsala in October for Mind and Life conference, actually, that after the conference he was introduced to several of the people who had served such masters during the kind of the illness, and then after taking care of them during that post-death meditation situation. And I don't know what when it's actually measured, if it will, there will be a machine sensitive enough to pick up those kind of very subtle signals.
I retrieved your talk. You mentioning the heart made me retrieve a question from the pile, from the audience, and this is very much in the manner of Western science has of course consigned the heart to just be a pump. So why scientists are only investigating the brain along with the same facts about the mind? According to Tibetan medicine, the heart is also important to the mind function. So are Western scientists missing something, even in the looking at so strongly at the connection of mind and brain?
Well, there certainly are large collections of nerve cells in different parts of the body. We call them ganglia. There's certainly one around the heart. There's one in the gut. And I was thinking about the octopus neural system that you were mentioning. There are nerve ganglia, each one of the 8 tentacles, that are obviously very complex and can do something. If it's not thought, at least it's a response to stimulus. So it may be that the way some people can think and feel without a brain is because the other parts of their nervous system in other parts of the body are carrying on some of these functions. We just haven't studied other parts of the body. And it may be that not only nerve cells, but other cells can carry on some of these functions. For example, the heart muscle certainly has its own electrical conduction system, which is independent of nerve cells in there. The heart muscle itself can conduct electrical signals. Maybe there's some way of communicating information through that we haven't really studied.
The octopus, some people may know this, but the the distributed brain is actually quite highly functioning. When an octopus loses an arm in an attack, that arm will continue to crawl away across the seabed and continue to make quite complex camouflage patterning for a while. So these are, I got cured of, after talking to a researcher, a field researcher on cephalopod intelligence, I got cured of, eating something that might be smarter than I am. So.
But I believe that there are now, there are small but certain group of scientists who do put as much emphasis in the body as they do in the brain. I know that at Emory University we have the Department of Psychiatry where Andy Miller and his team, they are very much about looking into the bodily system. I don't remember the specific substance that they gave, but when they inject that into the body, that apparently then that they can see that it makes the rats smarter, learn faster. Like that's, and also isn't there the understanding now that there are probably more cells in the gut than in your entire body, and then those cells in the gut are actually they may be the processing many of the this information that our brains do. So there is a small group, I think, that it is interested into the body as much as in the head.
More comments or questions?
이 티와디 가서 프로페서 브루스 크레슨을 주연이로 아니 이 티와 가서는 다른 쪽에 고랑이 담신나요 가도 다들 지금 심주 먹고 싶으신 나셔로 아직 네발은 마디마다 직 겨왕아지 챙여다 직 가서디 담 시타베미 통해라 소고든 좀 망고지 심주나 심나샤스로 아디 가미즈레샤스 이제 심주 나위 타마디라 주dom들은 코나라제 직 디덩을 인다 메기든 예바디 가주승에 열라 직 티와지 슈에 종로 되고직체 한 디네 아니 그나 당 아주 낭바다 낭베톤의 시에다 체릭베 단 미교 쪽으로디 아주 다 녀다 주기 강에세기 돌아디 양아들의 삼기로와 그래서 다 체릭병원에 다백다 니기 돌아다 bet 가이나 다 주기 셈제도는 가나 가점기 딱 등에 망고지 세트위어다 저 셈기 등에디 돌아단다직 다다지 칼로다 세트 유결로 매장로다 낭베 슝의 시에디 조다 망치다 셈도지 강에 세당 돌아지 탑라 망고지 두스다 남베슈니 두스 시기요래 다 디셰와들라다 단다디 와제 체리 원담기 디셰와디 따지 demba 가주스 인다 메기 따지라 예와 가주스 얘기요다 디게한다 와제 체리베기 따제 체기 네 인다 메스로와 기세 따제 체기 네라 인나 디라 따제 칸디스 나기요다 무스라이 티와저 직시로와 기세 따제 나기요는 단대기 체리베기 따지 dom시죠라 직다 따제 체기 따지 남샤죠라 남샤 디라 디 교당고다 무거스 디라 다지 와데 체리 원담기 교당 얘기 따지 탑람도 오지 다지 자시도 오지 여다 메란 다지 어디 티와디 두슈니 총종 두체스
My question goes to Bruce Grayson. So you have done so many research about consciousness that is not so much related with the brain itself, and there are many evidence. You have shown many evidence of rebirth and life after death. So, how much you are convinced by this kind of evidence that there is a life after death, or the consciousness is not that much depend on the brain itself, only the brain. And from the Buddhist point of view, when we talk about the purpose of learning something or doing something, the purpose is to benefit the physical world that we live in and the living beings that in this physical world. And in Buddhist tradition, there are many techniques or methods that is meant for benefiting our mental world or meant for the happiness. And how do you rate these methods that is mentioned in the Buddhist scripture, whether they are subjectable to modern neuroscience experiments. And if the techniques that is mentioned in the Buddhist traditions are not that much experimental in the modern framework of neuroscience, what changes should be made in modern neuroscience, like experimental system, in order to include these kind of methods?
I'll make sure I can remember all of those questions, so let me try. How convinced am I that there is life after death? I think that it is more likely than not. I can't put a number on it. I am raised in a Western scientific tradition where we don't ever know the answer. You just make it more or less likely. And the evidence has convinced me that it's certainly possible and probably likely that we survive death. But I can't say that I am convinced. And I think that is probably something that the Buddha would approve of, not saying you're convinced of it. In terms of the relationship between these states and improving our mental life, improving our happiness, I think the question of can consciousness exist without a brain is interesting to me intellectually, but what really attracts me to these study of near-death experiences is the way it does change people's lives, making them more compassionate, more loving, less attached. And approaching this from a Western perspective, I want to try to take apart the near-death experience and see what about that experience makes people change in those ways, and how can we replicate that. You asked about the value of the Buddhist traditions in cultivating these mind states. And I think that is a very valuable thing for Western science to start to approach. It's something that Western science hasn't done a whole lot with. And I think that's the value of Geshe Negi's program, that is making huge bridges between the Buddhist traditions and the Western science approach. Do you want to write that? I think that's the way that Western science needs to go.